you doing? Welcome. Lee. Make sure you grab the sheets. Well, good afternoon and welcome. We just had a coalition meeting of a number of members of Congress and of key grassroots leaders across the country who gathered here today, united in opposition to this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. The grassroots leaders who came together came from across the political spectrum. There were conservative leaders, there were pro-Israel leaders, there were leaders in the Jewish community, there were leaders in the Christian community. All stand together, convinced that the threat of a nuclear Iran is the single greatest national security threat facing America. All stand together convinced that this Iranian nuclear deal is a catastrophic mistake. If this deal goes through, a number of things will happen. Number one, over $100 billion will flow to Iran. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Much of that money will flow directly to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and other radical Islamic terrorists. Much of that money will be used to fund radical Islamic terrorism. Indeed, if this deal is consummated, it will make the Obama administration the world's leading financier of radical Islamic terrorism. Billions of dollars under control of this administration will flow into the hands of jihadists who will use that money to murder Americans, to murder Israelis, to murder Europeans. Now, yesterday in Africa, President Obama chose to take issue with my pointing out that incontrovertible fact. He belittled and attacked it and said it was intemperate to say such a thing. I would note nowhere in President Obama's remarks did he dispute the underlying facts. Nowhere in President Obama's remarks did he point to any other organization on the face of the globe that would be a larger global financier of radical Islamic terrorism than the Obama administration is trying to become. In addition to that consequence, this deal leaves 4 American hostages languishing in Iranian hellholes. It leaves Pastor Saeed Abedini, an American pastor, sentenced to 8 years in prison for professing his Christian faith. It leaves Amir Hekmati, an American Marine, wrongfully imprisoned. It leaves Jason Rezaian, a reporter, imprisoned for doing his job reporting on the news. I would note to all of our friends from the media, it ought to give you pause that this administration is content to leave a reporter from the Washington Post in an Iranian hellhole. And it leaves Robert Levinson, an American whose whereabouts are unknown right now. But the single greatest consequence of this deal, if it goes through, is that it will only accelerate Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. Iran is led by a theocratic zealot, the Ayatollah Khamenei, who leads chants of death to America, who refers to Israel as the little Satan and refers to America as the great Satan. Now, I agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu that this deal, that the threat of a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the nation of Israel, meaning that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, the odds are unacceptably high they would use those nuclear weapons in the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. And the threat that is posed to the United States of America is even qualitatively greater. The single greatest threat if Iran acquired even a single nuclear weapon would be that they would place that weapon on a rocket on a ship anywhere up and down the Atlantic. And they would fire that rocket straight in the air into the atmosphere. And if it got high enough and they could detonate a nuclear warhead, it would set off what's called an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. An EMP would take down the electrical grid on the entire eastern seaboard, would shut down the stock exchange and all of our financial system, would shut down the delivery of food and water and heat and air and basic transportation. The projections are that an EMP over the eastern seaboard would cost the lives of tens of millions of Americans. And they don't need targeting equipment. They don't need to hit a target. They need to fire it straight in the air. That is one nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran. And I would note, Iran is a nation every year that celebrates a holiday. It's an unusual holiday to Americans. Here in America, we celebrate the 4th of July, we celebrate Thanksgiving, we celebrate Christmas. In Iran, they have a holiday called Death to America Day. It is the anniversary of Iran seizing Americans hostages in the 1970s, and they gather outside by the thousands and chant Death to America. If history teaches anything, it is that if somebody tells you they want to kill you, believe them. This gathering we had of grassroots leaders collectively touched millions of Americans all across this country. And it is our intention, both the members gathered here and the grassroots leaders who participated in this meeting, to make the month of August a referendum on this catastrophic Iranian deal. It is my hope that millions of Americans light up the phones to Capitol Hill. Light up the phones to Democratic members of Congress, members of the House, and members of the Senate, to say, stand in support of U.S. national security. Stand in support of the nation of Israel. Stand in support of protecting the health and safety of millions of Americans. This deal on the merits is indefensible. As I mentioned, President Obama attacked my statement that his administration would become the world's leading financier of terrorism. Yesterday, I invited President Obama to participate in a debate. I would be happy to debate him at the time and place of his choosing, anywhere in the country in the next 60 days, to discuss the substance of this deal. If he believes that this deal can be defended, I would encourage him to defend it in front of the American people. If he's unwilling to do so, then he can send as his proxy Secretary of State John Kerry. Because on the merits, this deal is catastrophic for the American people. And I'm encouraged that the grassroots leaders, coming from very different ideological positions, are united that we shouldn't abandon our hostages in Iran. That we shouldn't send billions of dollars to fund jihadists to murder Americans. And that we should do nothing to facilitate Iran acquiring nuclear weapons while they pledge death to America and pose a mortal threat to murder untold numbers of Americans. Congressman Zell.
Well, thank you, Senator Cruz. Really a lot of strong...
Let's open it up for questions.
Senator, when you talked about the president criticizing your remarks, Governor Huckabee has also gotten criticism for his remarks relating to the Holocaust. Is there a possibility that the language you're using is too provocative or perhaps even inappropriate with respect to Governor Huckabee?
You know, it is unfortunate that the Obama administration wants to change the topic from the substance of the deal, from the risks that this poses to our nation, and wants to instead engage in a game of distraction and smoke and mirrors. So President Obama chose to attack Governor Huckabee. Governor Huckabee is a friend of mine. I'm proud to stand with Governor Huckabee, and I would note the substance of the comments that Governor Huckabee made, that substance is reflected as well by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has described a nuclear Iran as an existential threat to the nation of Israel. And as I've joked more than once, when he uses the word existential, he doesn't mean a bunch of Frenchmen in black berets chain smoking. He means literally going to the very existence of Israel. Likewise, when Prime Minister Netanyahu came to address a joint session of Congress. And the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and the entire cabinet shamefully boycotted the Prime Minister of Israel. That day, I was proud to host a panel discussion with Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate, Holocaust survivor. And Elie Wiesel stood up. The topic of that discussion was never again. And Elie Wiesel spoke about the one threat on the face of the planet that has the potential to once again murder 6 million Jews, as we saw horrifically, is a nuclear Iran. And so President Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry don't want to address the substance of the issues. They don't want to address the substance of the point I made, that if this deal goes through, the Obama administration becomes the leading global financier of radical Islamic terrorism, sending billions to jihadists who will use that money to murder Americans. And they do not want to address the substance of what Governor Huckabee and Prime Minister Netanyahu and Elie Wiesel all said, which is that this deal poses a threat of murdering millions of Americans, and anyone who stands with Israel should be categorically opposed to this deal.
Senator, specifically on Mike Huckabee's remarks, do you stand by them? Do you think they were controversial? Do you agree with them, refute them? Just specifically on his remarks.
You know, it is very interesting. The Obama administration wants to distract everyone, and at times the media is happy to focus on language and rhetoric. Let's focus on the substance. The substance is this deal poses the threat of allowing radical Islamic terrorists to murder millions of Israelis, millions of Europeans, or millions of Americans in the flash of an eye.
Not specifically President Obama's remarks, but Mike Huckabee's remarks.
President Obama's remarks were trying to distract from the substance of the deal. I recognize that the press hates to focus on substance. It's much more interesting to focus on politicians bickering. I'm not interested in bickering with another politician. I'm interested in focusing on the substance of how we protect the national security of this country and the lives and safety of millions of Americans.
You didn't find Mike Huckabee's remarks substantial.
I've answered your question numerous times.
Ultimately, you were elected president on your first day in office, and the deal was being implemented. Iran had abided by all its commitments. What would be your first course of action?
Any credible commander-in-chief, any serious commander-in-chief, sworn into office on January 20th, 2017, should be prepared to repudiate this deal immediately. Now, it is my hope that Congress reacts to millions of Americans standing up, and we stop this deal now, this fall. That is what should happen. But if it doesn't happen, here are the consequences of this deal. In all likelihood, when the next president is sworn into office, he or she will be advised that there are two and only two choices. That either the next president can acquiesce to Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, or the next president can use direct military force to prevent that. One of the most egregious consequences of this foolhardy deal is it makes the chances of military conflict much, much more likely. I believe in peace through strength. If you want to avoid military conflict, follow the path of peace through strength. Weakness and appeasement, whether it was of Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama, invites military conflict. And the reason this deal makes military conflict more likely is because what President Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry have succeeded in doing is unraveling the international consensus on sanctions that had brought Iran to its knees. Which means, in all likelihood, the next president, when he or she faces this situation, sanctions will be a much weaker tool, if available at all, because it would take months, if not years, to reassemble that international coalition. That is the legacy of the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy. Dissolving the coalition against sanctions and ensuring the next president either acquiesces in a nuclear Iran or has to use direct military force. And let me point out, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, there are two likely outcomes. One outcome is a nuclear Iran uses those nuclear weapons. Now, anyone thinking in the world of the rational, no rational person would choose to use nuclear weapons to murder millions of civilians. The problem is Iran is led by radical theocratic zealots. The Ayatollah Khamenei pledges death to America, leads chants of death to America. The father of the Iranian nuclear program, who's no longer with us, wrote in his last will and testament that he wanted the following words printed on his tombstone. Here lies a man who sought to annihilate the nation of Israel. Think for a moment about the bilious hatred that leads someone, the anti-Semitism, the bigotry that leads someone to write that in their last will and testament. In my view, if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, the odds are unacceptably high they would use their weapons. Or in the alternative, let's assume they don't use nuclear weapons. What is the alternative, the result of the Obama-Iranian nuclear deal when Iran acquires nuclear weapons? You immediately see proliferation throughout the Middle East. You see Saudi Arabia acquiring nuclear weapons. You see Egypt acquiring nuclear weapons. You see the Arab countries throughout the Gulf acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, who in their right mind would want to see nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East, nations that often have close ties to radical Islamic terrorists? And at the same time, if Iran is today the leading state sponsor of terrorists, imagine how aggressive they will be with nuclear weapons, convinced that there can be no retaliation. And by the way, that is the best case scenario. The thank God they didn't use nuclear weapons on America or our allies. They simply spawned a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East, which endangers the safety and security of the entire world.
What
Senator,
do you commit to the retaliation? The U.S. and Israel has a larger nuclear arsenal than Iran could perceivably have, even if it was to break the deal.
You are assuming that the Ayatollah Khamenei engages in rational cost-benefit analysis. You are right. Let's contrast this to another situation. I believe what we are doing, what the Obama administration is doing, is repeating the mistakes of the 1990s, of the Clinton administration with respect to North Korea. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration led the world in relaxing sanctions, did exactly what President Obama is doing now. As a result, billions of dollars flowed into North Korea. And North Korea promptly turned around and developed nuclear weapons. The estimates are they have roughly 50 nuclear weapons now. Now, the Obama administration, astonishingly enough, went and recruited the very same person that negotiated the failed North Korea deal, Wendy Sherman. They brought her back from the Clinton administration to negotiate the failed Iran deal. Literally, the one person on the planet who had messed this up previously, that's who they wanted to go do the exact same thing. But it's qualitatively different, and let me explain why. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. Both father and son, radical, unpredictable, extreme. But both, at their core, megalomaniacal narcissists. Which means some degree of rational deterrence is possible. Both father and son understood if they ever used a nuclear weapon, that day their regime would end. What is qualitatively different about Iran that the question just asked doesn't recognize is Iran is led by theocratic religious zealots who embrace and glory in death and suicide. If Iran were to use a nuclear weapon in the skies of Tel Aviv, it would kill vast numbers of Palestinians. And yet, given their religious extremism that embraces death, that may well be perfectly acceptable collateral consequences for Iran to have the opportunity to murder vast numbers of Jews. Religious hatred and bigotry does not comply with ordinary cost-benefit analysis. So you're right. If Iran were concerned about retaliation, they wouldn't use a nuclear weapon, but with religious zealots, with the sorts of people that strap on suicide vests, to blow themselves up and blow others up, cost-benefit analysis is not predictable or reliable.
Senator Cruz, a lot of your colleagues who have been critical of the deal have said, we're critical of this deal, we don't think it's going to work, but we're going to wait to go through the review process, 60 days comes, there's the vote, and then we'll vote against it. You, on the other hand, have introduced you've introduced legislation and amendments to kind of undermine this deal with the implementation before you could get through the review process. Now that we're heading into recess, is there anything else that you can do other than wait for the vote for the resolution of disapproval?
Absolutely. It's a very good question. Let me answer it two ways. Number one, in terms of resolving this issue, in the last Congress, I proactively introduced legislation that demonstrates how a strong commander-in-chief would deal with Iran. The legislation I introduced would immediately reimpose sanctions, would strengthen them to make them even more critical, and then lays out a clear path for Iran to lift the sanctions. If Iran wants to lift the sanctions, they must disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges. They must hand over all of their enriched uranium. They must shut down their ICBM program, which exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to carry a nuclear warhead to the United States of America. You don't need an ICBM to get to Israel. And they must, number 4, cease being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. That is how a strong commander-in-chief would handle it. I would note, by the way, that history is a powerful guide. We have seen a weak, ineffective president, Jimmy Carter, unable to stand up to Iran and, like Barack Obama, leave American hostages languishing in an Iranian hellhole. But we've also seen how we turn that around. It is worth remembering that in 1981, Iran, the very same nation, released our hostages the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in. That is the difference a strong commander-in-chief who is credible, who the Ayatollah understands, as he understood in 1981, that Ronald Wilson Reagan meant what he said. That's peace through strength, and it's worth noting in 8 years, the biggest country Reagan ever invaded was Grenada, because when you're a credible commander-in-chief, your enemies understand there are consequences. Now, secondly, you asked, what can we do right now? The entire purpose of this meeting was to energize and activate the grassroots. I opened the meeting by recalling a very similar meeting that Senator Mike Lee and I hosted 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we brought together leading grassroots activists to discuss Obamacare and our fight to defund Obamacare. That was roughly the same time of year. It was in the summertime. And at the time, conventional wisdom was there was no chance on earth the House of Representatives would ever vote to defund Obamacare because leadership was vocally dismissive of it. And all of you who are here in Washington will recall 2 years ago in the summertime, the idea that the House would ever do such a thing was scoffed at. It was viewed as ridiculous. Well, that meeting we organized presaged a nationwide grassroots movement that mobilized 2.1 million Americans to sign a national petition to defund Obamacare, to light up the phones to Washington, and it changed the incentives and the decisions of members of Congress. Every Democratic member of Congress has a choice to make. Every Democratic member can choose whether he or she will value the safety and security of the United States, our national security, standing with our friend and ally, the nation of Israel, and protecting the lives of millions of Americans, or whether he or she will value partisan loyalty to the Obama White House. That's the choice every Democratic member faces. The only hope that a sufficient number of Democrats are willing to stand up to the Obama White House and stand with the American people is if millions of Americans across this country light up the phones and express in clear and unequivocal words, we must defend this nation. And so it is my hope in the month of August and over the next 60 days to do everything humanly possible to energize and mobilize the American people, to get every member of Congress to stand up and perform the first and highest responsibility any one of us has, which is to defend the national security of the United States of America. I would note, a little over a week ago, I was on a panel discussion with former Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman. And Senator Lieberman agrees emphatically with me that this deal is a catastrophic mistake, a profound threat to the national security of America. And what I observed in that panel discussion is that I hope in the next 60 days we see the reemergence of Joe Lieberman Democrats. There was a time when there was a long tradition of Scoop Jackson Democrats, of John F. Kennedy, who was willing to stand up to the communists and stand up for our national security. Unfortunately, in today's Congress, Scoop Jackson Democrats have become more and more an endangered species. Joe Lieberman Democrats have become more and more uncommon. It is my hope that if enough Americans stand up and call upon our elected representatives to do the right thing, that we will see the reemergence. Senator Lieberman observed in that panel that this vote on the Iranian nuclear deal will be the most important, the most consequential vote most of these senators will ever cast in their tenure in the Senate. And I intend to do everything humanly possible to stop this terrible deal that endangers your children, endangers my children, endangers the future and safety of the United States of America.
Senator Cruz,
All right, we'll do one last question.
I wanted to talk about substance. Just the other day, you tried to get an Iran amendment on the highway that
Yes.
along with Obamacare
Yes.
and Planned Parenthood. Now, the Highway Trust Fund is running out of money in just a few days. So can people be blamed if they view your actions as maybe more related to grandstanding for political purposes for your presidential campaign as opposed to a serious effort to legislate?
Well, look, I appreciate impugning my intentions. I intend to use any and every procedural means possible to stop this terrible Iran deal. At the end of the day, the House passed an extension of the Highway Trust Fund. It was simple for the Senate to take it up. We're going to end up doing that in the next few days anyway. I introduced an amendment that would have prohibited lifting Iran sanctions unless and until Iran recognizes Israel's right to exist as a Jewish nation and releases the American hostages. Now, that's a bare minimum. That should be an easy proposition. Frankly, if we were voting on the merits, that should pass the Senate 100 to nothing. And I intend to continue to use every procedural means possible to stop this catastrophic deal. And at the end of the day, the tool that is the most potent is taking the case to the American people, to energize and mobilize them, to call on every member of Congress to do our jobs, and to defend the national security of this nation. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
You've spoken to Senator McConnell. Have you resolved that issue?
I'm going to keep